We've just come through the period that in cultural history we often call the Age of Reason, the Enlightenment. And during that period in the 18th century, you saw reason and rationality rule the day. You also saw an interesting phenomenon with the American and French revolutions as people began to focus on the importance of the individual. As liberty spread throughout Europe and the new United States, the idea of personal liberty began to be extremely important. And so when we get to the Romantic period, which comes right on the heels of that great age of enlightenment and freedom, we get a real focus on the individual. And this idea of the individual and the importance of the individual will be something that we can see celebrated in the art, music, and the literature of this Romantic era. So I want us to briefly talk about the Romantic concerns, the themes that I want you guys to be able to trace through this unit. One, Romantics were very important or thought that the expression of personal and subjective feelings and subjective, not objective truths were very important. And so we will see artists, we will see writers and musicians expressing their own personal emotions in their works. The Romantics also loved the fantastic and the exotic, anything that was different, that they thought was out of the traditional mainstream culture they were fascinated by. They also held a very spiritual, mystical view of nature. They saw nature as the touchstone for much of their imagination, and also as something that connected them with others and with the world at large. And finally, many of the Romantics were reacting to industrialization. During the 19th century, you see the very first railway built. Photography emerges. Dynamite is invented. The telegraph, the electric light, the internal combustion engine, all of these things led to industrialization, something that the Romantics to some degree were skeptical of because they felt like it robbed people of their individuality. So let's start tracing these things with a broad brush and prepare you for what's to come. Now, Romantic poets, which is what this slide is dealing with, were not like the poets of the 18th century. They weren't like John Dryden and Alexander Pope, who wrote for public occasions. The 18th century poet wrote to inform and instruct, and wrote constantly in rhymed heroic couplets. The 18th century poet appealed to the reason of the audience. The Romantic poet, however, believed that the source of poetry was not the outer world, but it was found within. And so by looking at these two contrasting views of the ideal poet, you really get an understanding of how important the expression of personal and subjective feelings became in the Romantic period. The 18th century poet, as Dryden said, focused on the idea that a poet should be reasonable and philosophical and in some measure mathematical for all those heroic couplets, and to have a very good understanding of the nature and manner of men, and to do something, produce a work that was public. The Romantic poet, as you see Wordsworth state here, is very different. The Romantic poet had a sensibility, enthusiasm, tenderness. Those are words that are associated with a person's emotions and not necessarily their reason. The Romantic poet had a a great knowledge of human nature and could express that. And so you see the very importance of expressing personal feelings and not necessarily objective truths. Indeed, for Wordsworth, poetry is emotion recollected in tranquility and the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. Poetry occurs for Wordsworth and the Romantics when they are in nature, when they see something in nature that deeply moves them and that recalls to their mind some feeling that they have about their lives. And then poetry results. And so this is a very different type of poetry than what you saw earlier with the 18th century poets. The Romantics also loved the fantastic and the exotic. The Orient was fascinating to the Romantics. They often wrote about their own personal dream worlds or conveyed those personal dream worlds in their art or in their music. One of the best examples of this is Samuel Taylor Coleridge's Kubla Khan, a poem that he wrote in an opium-induced dream. And so it's that fantastic nature of what resulted from his imagination that comes through in Kubla Khan and what the Romantics celebrated. You also have the emergence of what has come to be known as the Byronic hero. The Byronic hero first came on the scene in a poem written by Byron, and Childe Harold's Pilgrimage is the poem, and we first see the Byronic hero emerge through this particular poem. The Byronic hero was a mysterious, gloomy, brooding character who possessed superior powers and passions. He was often guilt-ridden, and this guilt drove him to his destructive behavior. He sees himself as above the law and is misunderstood, yet he's handsome, compelling, fascinating to others. Interestingly enough, the Byronic hero has stayed with us in culture and film and through the 21st century. Probably two of the most well-known Byronic heroes of this century have been Jack Bauer in the television series 24, and then James Bond. These are heroes that work right on the edge and often cross over between legality and illegality to get the job done. And this came from the Romantic period. Next, the Romantics saw nature as a spiritual inspiration. They believed that nature functioned as possibility, that was wild, it was untamed, and it should remain that way. Nature should be allowed to act as a touchstone for the imagination. It shouldn't be allowed to be controlled. And so as you see in this next slide here, very typical examples of the 18th century view of nature as controlled by mankind. You see the manicured gardens, the perfectly landscaped geometric shapes, the attempt by humans to tame and control and conform nature to their own ideas. The Romantic view was just the opposite. It was the wildness of nature that created the imagination of the Romantic spirit. And finally, the fourth concern of the Romantics was industrialization. During the 18th century, production became centralized. No longer did you have the one cobbler on the corner making a pair of shoes, but you began to have, in our terms today, the Nike plant, where one worker or several workers or hundreds of workers would make one piece of one product. The Romantics believed that that made it difficult for people to understand and be connected to what they were creating or making. If you made a shoe in its entirety, you understood that. But the Romantics would say if you only made the shoelaces or the eyelets the shoelaces go in, that you're disconnected from your overall work. They didn't like this, and because they felt it robbed people from their individualism. Industrialization led to urbanization that was inevitable. Just as today people go where the work is, so as factories began to be built in large cities, more people moved from the country into the city. And again, this is not something the Romantics would have been happy about. They felt that a human being's connection to nature was so important. And so if people were leaving the countryside and moving to the city, they felt like that there would be problems. And the problems that they felt would come from industrialization was a sense of alienation. People would become disconnected, not only from the natural world, but also from each other. And so what I want you to pay attention to as you move through this unit on the Romantics, look for these 4 ideas that we've discussed in this slide and see if you can see how the artists, how the writers, and how the musicians are celebrating the feelings of the individual and the importance of nature and the natural world and the excitement of the exotic and the different.